When we picture the mid-20th century wave of decolonization, the images that come to mind are almost entirely public. Protests spilled into the streets, new flags were raised over capital cities, and the fight for independence was waged as a highly visible, macro-level struggle. The globally recognized architects of these new nations were overwhelmingly men. Men standing at podiums, negotiating treaties, and focusing entirely on the logistics of nation-building. Early post-colonial literature closely mirrored this public-facing reality. The first wave of prominent authors wrote extensively about external wars, fractured national identities, and the clashes between native men and foreign empires. But building a historical record solely out of public battlefields and statehouses leaves out the lived experiences of half the population. This male-dominated focus created a massive historical blind spot. By equating the fight for freedom strictly with the public sphere, the history books completely ignored the politics of the home. In her foundational essay, theorist Gayatri Spivak asked a critical question: can the subaltern speak? The subaltern refers to populations that are socially, politically, and geographically outside the established power structure. Spivak argued that women in newly independent nations were the subaltern within the subaltern. They were silenced twice over, locked out of public political life by native men, and confined entirely to domestic spaces. This realization led post-colonial women writers to re-examine our understanding of resistance. The home is not a quiet sanctuary shielded from outside politics. It is the actual hidden political battleground. To understand exactly how this works, we have to look at a concept called double colonization. This animated diagram shows a home functioning as a trap, squeezed by two forces. First, an external imperial power suppresses native culture from above. Inside, the patriarchy shuts the doors, marginalizing women even within their own resistance movements. For a colonized woman, the oppressor wears two faces at once. It is the foreign governor dictating laws from the statehouse and the native patriarch enforcing submission in the living room. When we look at how this theory manifests in African literature, we see the crushing weight of traditional expectations placed firmly on women's shoulders. Take Buchi Emecheta's novel, The Joys of Motherhood. Rather than depicting African motherhood as a place of innate reverence, Emecheta deconstructs the idealized myth to expose it as a patriarchal trap that exhausts and consumes the protagonist. Beyond traditional domestic roles, the home is also infiltrated by foreign ideas. Author Tsitsi Dangaremba explores this in her novel Nervous Conditions. The story details how a westernized colonial education takes a severe physical and mental toll on young girls. They are forced to navigate the space between the modern schooling they receive and their traditional upbringing, leading to a fracturing of their identity and a loss of their native voice. Whether the pressure comes from the strict enforcement of local tradition or the injection of a foreign education system, the colonial home functions primarily as a site of psychological entrapment. Perhaps the most definitive text that weaponizes the domestic space is Jean Rhys's novel Wide Sargasso Sea. The novel sharply contrasts the lush, vibrant sensory experience of the protagonist Antoinette's Caribbean home with the cold, deeply restrictive environment of the English estate where she is eventually imprisoned. Within the walls of their home, Mr. Rochester functions as a dual agent of control, exercising his authority as a husband to enforce the broader logic of British imperialism. Rochester exerts control through highly specific tactics. He strips Antoinette of her native identity by renaming her Bertha, and he actively rejects her connection to Obia, a form of indigenous Caribbean folk magic that represents female resistance. Rochester's domestic gaslighting is a perfectly contained microcosm of the British Empire's macro strategy. To conquer a territory, the empire renames the land, isolates its people, and subjugates the native subject. Rochester simply does it in the bedroom. If Antoinette's story sounds familiar, it is because she is the origin of a famous pop culture trope, the mad woman in the attic from Charlotte Bronte's original Victorian novel, Jane Eyre. Rhys applies a crucial post-colonial twist to this classic character. She shows us that Antoinette's descent into madness is not a genetic flaw or some inherent exotic beastliness as the Victorian audience was led to believe. Instead, this madness is a perfectly rational psychological break. It is the direct, inevitable result of the relentless isolation and trauma inflicted by double colonization. This reframing completely changes the meaning of Antoinette's final act in the novel, where she sets fire to the English estate, Thornfield Hall. To the colonial gaze of the original novel, the fire is an act of pure villainy, but through the post-colonial lens, it is an act of purification, an ultimate expression of resistance, and a fiery return to her Caribbean roots. Rhys is just one voice in a much wider, global movement of post-colonial women writers who have dedicated their work to rewriting history from the female perspective. These authors even actively resist the colonizers' control of language itself. They choose to write in English, but intentionally bend the language, incorporating native rhythms, oral traditions, proverbs, and domestic vocabulary to make the colonizers' tongue their own. Changing national flags and electing new leaders are only the visible signs of sovereignty. True decolonization must penetrate deeper than the public square. The lasting legacy of post-colonial women's writing is the irrefutable proof that a nation can never truly decolonize its public sphere until it has first decolonized its homes.